I will start with a more general approach and understanding of what are the links between international migration and sustainable development agenda, meaning I will try to look at more conceptual argument why we should talk about Agenda 2030, and only then we should talk about international migration. What I would like to say first of all is that for the last 12, 15 years, it seems that the focus was on development, and usually the arguments for advocating human rights, gender equality, LGBTQI plus community were linked to development, but not to sustainable development. And what does it mean? It means that now, if you look at the last 15 years, when we had Millennium Goals, and you see now from 2015 when we have Agenda 2030, we see that the general level of poverty has been reduced, which is very nice, and maybe we should be happy, but we're not talking about inflation and other things. But unfortunately, there is an alternative process which is called social and economical inequalities, which is increasing. And if you look at the latest Oxfam reports, and if you look at the data that is coming from Lithuania, you will see that that's the biggest challenge today that we have. So at the same time, when we have poverty, which has been reduced very slightly, we have very huge social and economical inequality, and only then you have all the consequences of different kind of processes. It can be migration, it can be human trafficking, it can be human smuggling, it can be refugee crisis without refugees that we have in Lithuania at the moment, and all the other things. So we should actually focus once again on sustainable development. And I think that when it comes to migration policy making, sustainable development is a decent background to think about the holistic approach towards migration policies. And I think we will touch upon these issues during the fourth seminar, but what I would like to do now is to say a few words about the research that we did. You have the summary. It's also possible to get it, the extensive version of the report, about 13 countries, and now in these 13 countries, intercap partnership migration is being reflected at the Agenda 2030. So I think this is very important. And you know, I mean, if you would like for me to give one conclusion of this report, so I really have that in my mind, and it's very simple. And the conclusion is that the hyper-complex and hyper-holistic process at a global level is being dealt with super fragmented policies at the national level. So this is very important, especially when it comes to asylum migration integration funds. We haven't analyzed yet the other SDGs, as you know, related to climate, to other things. But when you look at inequalities, education, migration, and human trafficking, these are super holistic processes and super complex processes, while at national level is just fragmented policies. And when you go even deeper down in the local level, it's been much more fragmented because of the institutional subordination, different EU funds, and other issues. So I think this is very important. But you will read it, you will find it in this report. However, when it comes to Agenda 2030, we have to understand that it's not just migration. I think it's more about changing the way of thinking of how society is functioning in this 21st century. So I think that's why it's very important to understand that it's not just about the numbers that you have here. It's much more about what is behind those numbers. And I think that the Agenda 2030 is not just about dealing with the migration in the sense of migration management, but it's more humanizing migration process, because it was unfortunately dehumanized during the recent years, as we started to use very technical terms without any critical reflection. And these technical terms ended up in very specific and very fragmented migration and integration policies, unfortunately. So I think that the SDGs in particular and agenda in general should help us to bring back the more holistic understanding of migration. And I think what we should do is we should reflect these main documents that we have now. It's New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants and Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework that actually was prepared by UNHCR. Then we have very important issue of Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, then this upcoming Global Compact on Refugees, and then we have European Agenda on Migration, which was actually created at the peak of migration during the 2015 and then 16 later on. And then we have other agendas, especially UNHCR and IOM, which already started to localize these concepts through the national or regional strategic frameworks of activities in different regions and in EU member states. So I think this is very important. I mean, yeah, numbers, they are not they're important, but also we have to understand that we have very diverse societies and we have very diverse migration structure, let's say so. But because, I mean, if you look at the increase of number of migrants globally, it's just a 3.4%. But I mean, if you look at the increase of internally displaced people globally, so it's something that we should think about, because today we have 60 or more than 68 million of displaced people, which means that this is the highest number in the entire history of humanity. It's even higher than after the Second World War. So that's also something that we have to understand. And the biggest problem with this issue lies in the fact that when different migration streams are being organized all around the globe, so then when it comes to displacement and asylum, then you have very regional response, meaning that the majority of those displaced people, the majority of refugees, they are kind of staying in the one region or in a few countries, as we have now really intense situations in Lebanon, in Jordan, in other countries, even in Africa, such as Kenya, where they host the largest refugee camp. So this is very important. We know that these are the millions, but again, we shouldn't talk about the millions, we should talk about human beings, trying to humanize this process. And here the sustainable development comes in two ways. So, well, the first way is we really see that migration in general sense is giving very positive, I would say, sign for the development. So we have that migrants are filling critical labor gaps, they're paying taxes, we have cultural and informational capital. Again, for the countries of origin, you have the remittances, which is kind of the tool to reduce the poverty. Then we have, let's say, technology and valuable skills, which are being organized by those returnees. And I think this is the best example in Lithuania, that we have young people which are coming back to Lithuania while trying to apply those knowledges and competences that they got from all around the globe. So these are the very kind of positive things on migration, and we know those by heart. But again, we shouldn't be concentrated only on those development issues, because that is something which is called sustainable development. And sustainable development, sustainable societies, they are much more about decreasing inequalities and challenging these kind of things as exploitation and discrimination. And during nowadays, if you look at all the global slavery indexes, we see that it's not just only about exploitation, discrimination, human trafficking, human smuggling, but also it's more about securitization and politicization of migration as a policies and as a processes. Because if you look at Trump elections, if you look at Brexit was made on the migration card and not on the refugee card, but more on the card of those who are coming from Eastern Europe towards Western part of the European Union. So that's also very important. Look at the recent electoral campaign of Orban. I mean, for the 1 month, the focus was on migration, while during that month only one migrant came to the Hungarian border. So also we understand that this is also, we live in a post-truth society, and I think my colleague from Dacia will reflect upon this, that the problem is that after the securitization, what we have very, I would say, hostile and unfriendly environment and the climate in receiving societies, where majority of the people overestimate the number of migrants, and those overestimations are very high. And it's not just about overestimations, it's about having the very stable and negative stereotypes, prejudices, which are being triggered, I would say, by the media within the framework of those post-truth societies. So there are many, many challenges that we have to deal with, and basically the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 tries to do that through different ways. So what you do have here is there is a green line on the top, so it's very specific references of specific sustainable development goals towards international migration, and then we have other entry points. So what is very important in this regard is that again, we see the holistic thinking which is happening on a very global scale, but at the end of the day, we see very fragmented implementation on the local level. And why it is happening? Because that's about migration. I mean, if you talk about gender equality, if you talk about the rights of the child, if you talk about the pension systems and other challenges that we are facing, it's crystal clear that you have more support from the European Parliament and from different parliaments from the left to the right. But when it comes to migration and integration, there you have a challenge. And usually migration, that's the main, I would say, indicator which shows that there is a lack of solidarity even at the EU level. I'm not talking about the global issues. So again, the argument is that the holistic thinking, it's very good, it's very good approach, but unfortunately all the migration policy implementation, especially in the SDG number 10, where you have decent migration policy implementation, is being left at the national level for the countries. So again, this is more or less the same that is happening on integration agenda in the European Union, when the national countries, they have their own perspective, understanding, and usually it's being organized and reframed in the context of the nation state, especially that is happening at the U28 level. So these are the main entry points, and what is very important again to understand that 3 SDGs, they are reflecting very important challenge which is actually prevailing nowadays, but we are not even thinking about it. It's human trafficking and modern slavery. And if you look at the SDGs, you have SDG number 5, which is focused on gender equality, and then we have 5.2 objective trafficking with the focus on women and girls. Then we have the very important SDG number 8, which is talking about decent labor conditions, but then you have trafficking and migrant workers' rights, which is extremely important today. And then at the end of the day, we have 16, which is trafficking, including child trafficking. So again, we have to understand that migration brings development, but in order to create sustainable development, we have to look at those negative consequences that actually we have now at this moment. And we really see that human smuggling, human trafficking, and modern day slavery is something that we should have in mind, and we should challenge it. So basically, this is a very basic overview of how a sustainable development agenda is looking at international migration. Once again, it's more holistic approach, but as I already said in our report, you will see that in many of the countries in the region is being implemented in a very, very fragmented way. If you'll go for the more specific approach, and if you'll try to look at how every single objective within the one or the other SDG is being reflected, so again, you see the interlinkages. So that's why I was talking about, holistic approach on the global level and fragmented approach at the national level. Because in one case you see that actually human trafficking as a process or as a disaster is embedded in at least 3 SDGs. While you're going down and you analyze those SDGs in the national level, you see that they are kind of reflected in the different policies without interlinkages. So I think this is very important for us to understand that it cannot be in this way anymore, because that's why you see that those traffickers are far ahead of us, basically, and we are just trying to deal with the consequences. And just one example, I mean, if you look at, let's look at Lithuanian case. You have Global Lithuania program, which is very nice, and we like that program, but you won't find any single word about human trafficking in Global Lithuania program, while very big proportion of Lithuanians are being trafficked and they are trapped in a modern slavery trap in UK and other countries. While the file of human trafficking is basically linked to the mandate of Ministry of Interior. So again, on the Agenda 2030, you have a holistic approach that we really like and we really appreciate, but at the national level, we don't see these links. Even you do not see the theoretical links in the policy documents. I'm really not talking about the practical implementation of those issues. And we can go further, but I think we can develop this issue in the workshops, and we can look at what the linkages should be. Unfortunately, I have just 5 minutes, but also, the very important aspect of these SDGs and migration is we have to understand that this is a never-ending process. On the one hand, you see that migration, diaspora, and refugees, they kind of contribute to the development outcomes. Well, we think that it contributes to the sustainable development outcomes, but at the end of the day, it affects, again, migration and immigration and displacement. And if you look not to the human beings, but to the process, again, you see the same, that migration as a part of development, it leads to either sustainable outcomes or sustainable development outcomes, and then it targets migrants, refugees, and other groups as either vulnerable groups or either as the actors of development in the countries of destination, transit, and others. So at the end of the day, you see that all those SDGs, they kind of are interlinked with each other, and if you look at migration, explanations of how migration has started, what is the root causes of migration and a continuation for different migration industries, types and systems, then you will see different migration drivers, push and pull factors, and once again, you see that there is a huge unawareness that we really do not understand what migration is. And I mean, even if you look at the integration strategies, you will see that bigger part of the societies and the countries themselves, they establish integration policies, but at the end of the day, if you think about very simple questions, so what is the final outcome of integration? Nobody will tell you. So that's, again, that an awareness also creates very fragmented policy development. And just for you to understand, if somebody of you are researchers and sociologists of migration, so there is the Global Compact for Migration, and you will see there very specific data analysis chapter where we have the understanding that all the migration policy making should be linked to the research-based evidences. And here is just an explanation of how it could be done through the consultations and through the awareness raising. And again, the Global Compact for Migration, it challenges the way of thinking about migration, the way of we use the definitions, and the way these definitions are being institutionalized in our minds and in different political and public discourses. So this is also a very important piece of reference that we should be looking. And a few more things. There are good things that we have. Remittances. Yeah, we know we'll be talking about those things during the seminar, but just to understand that there are some countries where remittances of migrants sent back to the countries consist of 40, 50, and even more % of GDP, which means that remittances is kind of the most important resource for development. But if you look at the development over time and space, you will see that migrant remittances is even more higher now than the foreign direct investment on the one hand, but at the end of the day, you see that this is the most stable form of resources, where even during the economical crisis, migration remittances were as stable as basically never before. So it's not just about GDP, it's just also about the sending and receiving these remittances, investing those. Then you see the potential of migration, where the majority of biggest companies and the things that we have now, from Apple to Amazon, they're being built either by migrants or by the first or by the second generation of migrants. And it's not by being built by migrant employees. These are the companies that are established by migrants. You know, Steve Jobs was a refugee child of the Syrian father. And there are many other examples. So basically, we also have to understand that it brings the huge potential for migration, and it's not only here, but it's also the Zatari camp, because you have, I mean, 5-7 years, in a Zatari camp, you have internal economy of 300 business branches with the pizza delivery service and wedding dresses. Yeah? So that is something that we see that potential. However, at the same time, you have to look at the challenges, not only potential opportunities, because we are thinking about sustainable development, because here comes human trafficking. Even in Europe in the 21st century, when you talk about human rights and we're trying to implement anti-trafficking policies, you more 100,000 modern slaves, which is kind of something which is not explainable. But at the end of the day, again, if you will frame it through the perspective of development, you can take any single stream of migrant workers and you will see that, that's example from Nepal, but there are many examples in Gulf states and even in European Union where, we are happy about remittances being sent by Nepalese migrants from all around the globe back to Nepal. But when you see at the end of the day what is the cost of those remittances, you see that the number of people who died as a migrant workers in the construction sites decreased from 90 in 2008 to 1,000 in 2014. So is it about development? Yeah. Is it about sustainable development? No way. So we have also to understand it's not just about Nepalese migrants, it's just about Lithuanian migrants in London. That is the same thing, and this is the same with the Nepalese in Lithuania. So the argument is that, when you think about migration policies, you see very fragmented way of organizing this. You see that there is a specific migration policy for the specific target group. But labor market and neoliberal regime will take everybody. The exploitation will take everybody. Either you're a migrant, either you're local, either you're a refugee or asylum seeker. They will take you and exploit you. So that's the holistic crime. And we're dealing with the holistic crime with the very fragmented policy measures. And I think this is the biggest problem, and I don't have time for more conclusions to be developed today, but what I will just try to say once again is that Agenda 2030 is really important for us, and not just to reflect migration, but also finally at the end of the day to try to look at more holistic approach and try to understand that diaspora policy might be linked to development, but also diaspora policy should be linked to the human rights implementations of global Lithuania, because if you want to be global Lithuania, so let's be global, not be selective. So I think I will finish my talk, and thank you very much. If you have some questions, so feel free. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes for questions, and just raise your hand and you'll get the microphone.
Good morning. I wanted to ask about the Agenda 2030 and the way that you think it could be then brought over to national level policies, but also EU level policies. I mean, obviously these goals have been there already for a while, but we don't see them really transposed in EU common migration and asylum policy. What are the steps to take? And second, there were many points where you mentioned how this actually could be reflected on national level policies, but are these EU level planning documents something that is taken into account on a national level? Because you probably have something like Lithuania 2030 as well.
Yeah. I think it's very I see now. Very relevant question, because I mean, if you look at EU migration policy, we have to be crystal clear that it's not being implemented at the national level. That's what we see even from the MIPEX. And the main important outcome of the MIPEX is that those areas where it seems that the EU has the right to change the situation, like family reunification, posted workers, it seems that in this regard, the integration areas are being developed in the countries where EU doesn't have the impact or supranational level of authority, to change, like naturalization, access to citizenship, and political participation, especially in Latvia and Estonia. Then you see that there is no any change. So basically, in these cases where EU has that power, you see that it might be changed. The problem is that the most conceptual part of the policies of integration, they're being left for the national level, because that's the nation state. And I think that I think this is something that I have in this conclusion, is that we are taking these definitions for granted, because if you look at the history of integration, and I think it's very much linked to the policies, it's being transferred from Chicago School of Sociology. That's basically, if you remember this European-American Polish peasant in Europe and America, written by Florian Zanetsky. Well, at that time, the integration as a concept that was more human-based. Basically, at that time, you had British English, American English, Lithuanians, and whatever you can take, and then the American emerged. But they called it integration, because the integration was organized at the equal level without institutions. Yeah? I mean, you had this pyramid of racial segregation, but basically the integration was organized in a way of equal course between different people. That's why integration was functioning in the melting pot concept. When we brought it into the nation state, so basically we took integration mandate from the society and put the mandate in the institution. And that thing created very, very prominent indicator of power relations, that now we have that somebody which is there as a watchdog integrates those who are there. So basically from the very holistic approach, we came towards very fragmented approach, and we put this, not only the concept and the processes in institutions, but decided to put people in institutions. Mucienieki in Latvia, Rukla in Lithuania, and all the way around. So I think, while answering your question, I would say that I'm not very optimistic. That's why I told that it's super hyper complex approach with a super hyper fragmented policies. And even looking at the European Union document, you see a very nice way of thinking, which is fine. Even European migration on agenda, it reflects the building resilient cities, building resilient societies. That is nice, but when you see at the end of the day how it's being transferred to the local level, it's kind of a challenge. Even now in Latvia after the elections, it's very interesting how these things will be developed. But unfortunately, I wouldn't be so optimistic, well, especially looking at the research that we done. Yeah.